So on this panel, we're going to talk about the potential for AI to shorten the diagnostic odyssey. I know there's been a lot of excitement around AI throughout the healthcare continuum. I've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about it and looking at it from a drug development side. But I think one of the things that's exciting about AI is that one of the most immediate opportunities to really give this patient benefit is on the diagnostic side. We'll find out if people agree with me here. But maybe we can start just by talking about the diagnostic odyssey. And Melissa, I don't know if you all know Melissa and the work she's done with Mondo, but there's reference to that in the previous panel. But the reason we're talking about 10,000 plus rare diseases today, rather than the 7,000 we kept hearing about, is a lot to do with Melissa's work in harmonizing these various databases. But, you know, Melissa, what do we know about the diagnostic odyssey and you know, how much variance is there in that?
So that's a wonderful way to start the panel. Thank you so much for bringing me here. It's such an amazing event, and truly grateful to Global Genes for everything that you all do. So I think, you know, just to kind of maybe walk through, you know, kind of a diagnostic odyssey through the lens of an informatician, because that's who I am, and the ways in which we try to help you and fail, essentially. And so if you think about, you know, we start off with a child, maybe it's a newborn. A lot of a lot of rare diseases are pediatric, and many affect newborns. But you know, newborn screening panels don't have most rare diseases, so it's missed, and it's not until the child isn't doing well, either shortly after birth or in the early pediatric years. But of course, many rare diseases also do not occur until later in life as well. So first of all, we don't recognize them. So babies are not born. Not all babies are born. Not all kids live near, you know, primary academic medical centers that have robust diagnosticians. You know, most of the world does not have access to that, and I think that our academic community and research forgets that. So the first step of the diagnostic odyssey is just anybody, a nurse, a doctor, a parent, family member, noticing that something is amiss. And taking that to your clinicians and making sure that that's something that's taken seriously, and that the individual features that are noticed are actually understood to maybe not be something commonly seen, or not be commonly seen in the sort of combination in which it's seen. And that's the first step where we fail, because those individual clinicians are not trained to diagnose rare diseases. They're trained to take care of the masses, and so we have not given them the adequate tooling. And this is where AI is really going to help us. So how can we help with that? And one of the things that I'll be talking very briefly about in our talk tomorrow is about how do we do kind of public health surveillance, or just clinical reporting on patients, so that we can flag patients that may have unusual features that co-occur, to help provide clinical decision support for every clinician everywhere, not only expert diagnosticians. So that's the first part, and that part is one of the longest parts of the diagnostic odyssey. The second part is, after you've gotten to that point, we've got to get you through the onslaught of testing, and our insurance policies in this country anyway tend to make that challenging to get paid for. You need trio sequencing, and that's not available to everyone everywhere, depending on your insurance. And so you have to go through this very long stepwise set of labs and tests until you can maybe even get to that point. And that only, you know, that may or may not result in an easy diagnosis, because your variant might be so rare that it's not in the databases, or that it's missed for one reason or another, or it's not solely a genetic disease. And that's where we fail on the second front, is that those tools are not very good yet at integrating as many different kinds of data modalities and boiling it down to something that, you know, maybe not your general practitioner level clinician, but, you know, a more expert clinician can actually help guide the diagnostic process. And then, of course, there's giving you a diagnosis, and, you know, there's you know, what I think a lot of you may not realize is the army of people that it takes to get a patient a diagnosis. Hundreds of people work on all various aspects of doing the analyses, doing the clinical reviews, to give you that diagnostic. And that's not, again, not available to everybody. And then finally, once you have a diagnosis, we don't really have a way of recording most of them in the electronic health record because there aren't any codes for that. So it gets tucked into the notes. And that means that the next time the next patient with the same diagnosis comes along, none of that knowledge that was captured as part, that was hundreds of people that helped create that diagnosis, that knowledge is lost to the next clinician that has the next patient with that same disease. And so that's the third place where we fail.
So, Kat, you're the physician on the panel. You've been through medical school.
Yes,
You know, so if you have someone with symptoms, there's a patient thinks something's wrong, what is the doctor trained to think?
Yeah, so I see a lot of these issues that were just mentioned in clinical practice. I work both as a primary care provider as well as a physician scientist for rare disease, so I'm on both ends of the spectrum. I can tell you for primary care, or let's say general practitioners that are in the community, we don't have time to look into each individual patient. You might have weird random symptoms that we can't explain. It's going to take us years to follow up on those just because of all the other things that we have to tick. So all the preventive care that insurance dictates us to do, all the other general things before we get to your specific symptoms. And then we don't really have time to look things up, you know, behind the scenes. We are back to back to back to back. There is no non-clinical time for us to really dig into something and think about what could this patient possibly have? Where should I refer them to, right? And so that is part of the reason there is such a huge diagnostic delay for rare disease. And so it is very important to bring these tools out into the community, not just be available at academic centers, but in the everyday practices where the regular patient is being seen most frequently, right? Those are the kinds of providers that would benefit from these AI tools the most, to kind of give them the initial hints right at the point of care. Hey, this patient, based on the EHR data, may have XYZ disease. Here, like 3 or 4 different options, most likely to least likely. This is how you could test them right now, or this is how you could refer them. So at least you're like increasing the speed at which you can get this person worked up, rather than waiting for the next time they come back in a year or 2, right? So hopefully we will get to that point pretty soon. And to Melissa's point, there is true that rare disease often doesn't have an ICD code, which makes things more challenging, even for AI, because a lot of the time we go off structured data, which includes ICD codes, numeric values, standardized data, right? Now with the rise of NLPs and LLMs, we are more able to scrape through.
Just natural language processing and
yes.
Large language models.
That's true, yes. Okay. Think of your ChatGPT functions, right? So these things we are more able to use in the electronic medical record as well. In fact, at UCSF, we now have a plugin for ChatGPT that can go through the medical records and you can query it. What do you think this patient most likely has? This is a research environment for right now, not used in clinical practice, but we're getting there. So progress is being made in that area.
I want to talk about what each of you are doing to apply AI to shorten the diagnostic odyssey. But before we get into the kind of individual uses, you know, I'd like to have each of you talk about what you see the potential for AI to actually shorten the diagnostic odyssey. And maybe Erik, you can start.
Well, I think that the role of AI in this entire ecosystem is, first of all, in creating business viability for pharma to invest more into therapy, for payers to be friendlier for the diagnostic process, kind of being less of an obstacle through the testing and the process. And the way AI can do this is that we hear very often that rare is rare for the individual, but it's common in the community. So to deliver on that statement, AI has the ability to create that scale, and that scale is the key for the business viability across the board, because once you align the financial interests of everybody in the ecosystem, a lot of good things happen. So that's the starting point. To accomplish that, if we look at what we do, so we use our AI capabilities to create two products. One is a genetic health risk assessment for parents, and the other is, and it's called a child development checker, and the other is a decision support tool, or if you will, a differential diagnosis assistant accelerator. It's phase to gene. And you may think of them as being on two ends of the diagnostic timeline. So the child development checker is for the parents to get engaged at the earliest point possible when they encounter the first symptom that they may encounter it as a developmental, let's call it a hiccup, or something that they feel is not right. So this is at the very beginning. At the very end, when you're sitting in front of the expert that has thousands of options, so how to help that expert to choose the options that are the most viable. So shortening that is making the timeline between these 2 points to be as short as possible. And one of the things that we have seen, we just looked at the cases of when diagnosis was successful, when we read about all those stories where cases went, well, there is one thing in common. There was a parent who was very engaged, was a true advocate for the child's health. All the other stories are about, hey, listen, we were sitting there, we didn't know, we were told, and bounced around. So we started at the very beginning and we said, let's give the parents an opportunity to be the best advocates for their child's health. That's why the child development checker was created, to get the parents involved from a point of, and given the knowledge, the confidence, to try and drive the conversation through all the experts that they need to work with. And when the parents are involved and they know what they're driving toward, not to overstep the boundaries, it's not a competition with the doctors. On the contrary, it just makes it easier instead of being put, into the process of, hey, why don't you wait for this test or that test? When the parent knows what they need to ask for, they can drive the process in a much more effective way. So this was the main goal. And then when they're sitting in front of the doctor, how do I give the doctor, the clinician, all the information that the parent has, but in such a form that they can understand and they can process quickly? Like, take the patient's story in its entirety and process it and turn it into the HPO terms that are relevant for the conversation. Take all the phenotypes, all the indicators, all the health history, all those little data points that matter, and present it in a meaningful way, in a structured way, for the expert, for the doctor to make the right decision. And this is exactly the role of AI. The AI is capable to take the noise and turn the noise into structured, meaningful data. AI should not make decisions. AI should present the key data points for the expert to make the clinical decisions. And AI can be very good in processing the noise and turning it into something meaningful.
So you mentioned the note that gets buried in the electronic health record. Is AI going to rescue that from obscurity?
I think so. And that is exactly where these AI tools can be most helpful, by bringing things to the surface when we don't have time to do a deep dive chart review for every patient that we see. I give you an example. There has been a study published just recently that showed that on the primary care front, if I wanted to give you the care that you're supposed to have per clinical guidelines, it would take me 27 hours per patient per visit. Obviously, that's not possible. So let's say that you also have a rare disease. Do you really think I have the ability and the time to really do a deep dive into the medical chart and then also compare it with the research that's out there to try to figure out what rare disease it might be and how to test for it, right? That's not possible. So having AI on board that is able to uncover these structured and unstructured data that is deeply buried somewhere in the medical record will be immensely helpful for us.
Immediate return from this?
So I think, so far as the notes are concerned, there's so we developed the human phenotype ontology that you were referring to, and it's been translated into layperson, and I'm going to mention that tomorrow in my talk, which is sort of getting clinicians and patients to speak the same language, but behind the scenes we can have the same kind of informatics infrastructure, and having the patients collaborate on the creation of that content. And I think there's many things that patients observe, because our lives are not lived in the clinical encounter, they're lived in the world at writ large. So capturing that information, like your baby's not able to cry or inconsolable or things like that, that are things that are documented from home. So making sure that stuff gets into the notes or into structured data in some form, so that there can be a collaboration. So I'm really building on what you suggested. But one of the caveats, I think, is that, the notes, because of the way that our electronic health record systems work, there's a lot of copy paste. And as an informatician, it's very hard to manage, like, what's actually changed about a patient from one point in time to the next point in time, if it's a copy paste. And so this is where we're going to see, huge explosion of improved tools for clinicians, so that you can dictate your notes and have the LLMs help extract most salient information on the fly, and then you just vet it. And that way we can sort of end the copy paste problem and start doing a better job of actually documenting what is persistent and what is new in terms of the patient's features. And then that in turn will help the AI tools that we use downstream from that to help present back to you. We saw these new things that's very consistent with, these three known diseases or known, adverse outcomes, and really kind of feed that information directly back to the clinician in near real time. So there's not a 27-hour lag of chart review, right? And so the AI tools are happening both at the time of capturing that clinical information as well as at the time of interpreting it.
You all can correct me if I'm wrong here, but when I think about what each of you are doing, you're really using AI to identify when a patient is likely to have a rare disease and recommending a genetic test, as opposed to diagnosing them through AI. So let's start with face to gene, which is the most commercial of all of these, and you actually have experience out in the world. But what's been the result with this? And maybe you should take a minute and explain what exactly it is, how it works.
Okay, so about the AI itself. So we have the world's largest crowdsourced data set of 600,000 cases of diagnosed patients with their pictures and HPOs and their health history. And we let a handful of our AI engines to run through those and to find what's in common to all those sets. And the results were absolutely amazing.
And just for clarification, many rare diseases will have a specific facial dysmorphia associated with them.
Yeah, so there are, so the thing that we know the most for is for the ability to recognize rare diseases in the face. But we have additional AI engines that can pick up the health indicators from the clinical notes, from HPOs, and from other cases, including for those that don't have a facial dysmorphology. But about the face itself, imagine taking 600,000 diagnosed cases, and computer vision has the ability to pick up the smallest signals that even an expert just cannot see. And even if you can, just face it, even the patient who sees even the doctor who sees many patients, there are just so many of those variants that there's just no way that it will be able to actually identify and recognize all. And this is, again, the power of AI. AI is not biased, is not limited by memory, so it can find the right answer in all this noise. So this is the core capability. And maybe to elaborate on that, we actually took a page from, what are the best practices in the clinical workflow? And the best practices, like was said here, is that there are so many people who are involved in that. It's dozens or hundreds or thousands of people that are in the process. So we figured there will be no single AI engine that will be able to give all the answers. That's why we built several to say, we're going to let, so we have one algorithm that identifies rare disease. It's known deep Gestalt. The other one is Gestalt Matcher, who can recognize changes. So that's to your point, what actually changed. And then another one that can look at HPOs, and another one that can look at the health history, et cetera. So we let all those experts review the information, and then the overlap between them, or they have to have a consensus in order for the system to say, okay, we have here something that is worth looking deeper into, and this is how it's presented to the doctor. So what Face2Gene does on the side of expediting the differential diagnosis is showing, this is the information I have, this is what it could be, and it presents a short list of cases and says, well, here are the top 3 options based on what I see, based on the phenotype, based on health history, et cetera. These are the options that you have. That I will share with you an example of how helpful it is. We spoke with the president of the Human Genetic Network for Latin America, and he was talking about how alpha-aminoacidosis is being diagnosed. And in many cases, it actually happens downstream from a lysosomal disorder review. But because it's so rare, because it's 1 in a million, many doctors just don't even consider that. And it's, and it's sometimes being lost. This is the power of AI. It floats it up as a possibility. So Face2Gene is able to say, it may take you months until you come to the conclusion, if not years, until you come to the idea that you need to look at it, but it will show it as a high option before. On the other side of it, the child development checker, what it would do, it would take all the information, like you said earlier, in the example of a developmental issue of something that the child didn't talk right or didn't move right or had a food allergy, et cetera, that the doctor may not have the time to get into all this and bakes it into the conversation. So what Face2Gene does, it takes the clinical information that the doctor has, merges it with the patient's story, and creates a full picture.
And I'm a physician, and I have a kid in my office. This is a phone-based app, right?
This is a phone-based.
Use my phone to take a picture.
Correct.
I'm not waiting weeks for a result. I'm getting.
The best way to think about that, if you guys know, WebMD and the symptom checker in WebMD, imagine you go through a symptom checker, you give some symptoms, which you may think of them as health history points, or you upload a picture, and the system will tell you, hey, based on that, you should talk to an expert. Here's a list of experts. You can connect, you click, and that data will be pushed to the expert, and the expert sits with Face2Gene and will be able to pull so the point that you made that I think is so very, very crucial, like one of the things that we heard so many times is that the problem with rare disease, there are not enough geneticists, not enough experts, not enough people who know. We need to bring more experts, and I agree, but it will take what? A decade, 2 decades, 3 decades until enough people, until the numbers change dramatically. So what we can do right now is how to let the people who are currently there do a lot more. And that's exactly where AI helps. So the same doctor who right now, no way that would spend 27 hours, also because the payer would not pay for the 27 hours, the AI can do the 27-hour worth of work and bake it into the 12 minutes that the payer would actually pay for. So the doctor would actually look at it and say, okay, I have here something. And the only way to do that, in our opinion, is to involve the parents so they will contribute the full health history and pictures and information and everything else, because this takes a lot of time, and it sometimes holds critical information. And if the parents are involved, it takes a lot of the load off the shoulders of the doctors.
So it's a long path for many people to actually get to a point of getting a genetic sequencing test. I think one of the things that surprises people is that, in a large number of cases, they will find it at best provides a variance of unknown significance. Maybe 35% at best is when you'll actually get a clear diagnosis. Your tool was devised to identify when a patient should be referred for genetic testing, but I'm wondering, does it help identify those variants of unknown significance? Does it help give a clue as to what a patient might have?
That's a fantastic question. Actually, there is an interesting dichotomy. The more advanced the genetic sequencing becomes, the more complicated and sophisticated the reading and interpretation becomes. And the more important it becomes to choose your target properly when you get into the sequencing. So the short answer to your question is we actually have a handful of studies. So we have more than 120 peer-reviewed publications in medical journals that actually reviewed that question. What is the positive predictive value of RAI and how it aligns with the testing. And it was a very interesting review that was done to see what happens when you overlay next generation sequencing with the phenotype data that comes from us. And I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to embarrass myself by saying something entirely wrong, but I encourage you, if you go to FDNA.com and you look at the publications, this study is pretty prominent. The short story is that if you look at the short list that phase 2 gene generates, and you look at the top 10 results, and you look at the analysis that comes from NGS, you will come to close to 99% chances of getting the answer right, if indeed it's a condition that falls within the scope of what our AI can pick up, right? So yes, it's a major accelerator. But the other thing that we have done, so this was the short answer, is that yes, it can significantly improve this question around the variance, how to handle those variants of unknown significance. But the other thing that we have done is we decided to include testing as part of the service. So we sponsor the testing. We trust our AI so much that we don't go now to labs or to whomever and say, hey, why don't you use this as this? We actually say, if you go through our flow and we flag something and we believe that this could be the right case, we'll pay for that test. We know that the answer is going to be right. And I can tell you with pretty high accuracy how many of those will pan out, in the right way. But even today, we do the test in such a way that we do this on an NGS backbone so that we retain a lot of the data, so that even things we don't know today, we will figure out tomorrow. And this is part of our AI commitment to continue and improve that.
So, Kat, you had done some very interesting work on a rare liver disease that you were able to scour electronic health records of was this the UCLA hospital system, and identify patients based on an algorithm you developed that might be suspected of having this disease. Can you explain what you did and how it evolved?
Yeah, so this was a research collaboration we had between UCLA and UCSF because we were both specialist centers for acute hepatic porphyria, a rare liver disease. The question was, could we use EHR data to devise a predictive algorithm to then try to pick up undiagnosed patients earlier than what a clinician could? And we tested that only in an academic hospital environment, which means that the patients that were referred to us had already been referred to us, right? There was already a reason they were at an academic center versus in a community. And yet we were still able to make a diagnosis that was almost 2 years earlier than what an academic physician would be able to do after referral. So that is a huge improvement. So we are going to try to use that model in the community and see how much more can we decrease the diagnostic delay here. Another side effect of that was that we found out that a lot of the porphyria patients didn't classically present. So one of the problems we have in medicine is that when you do suspect a patient of having a certain rare disease, we think of it in a schematic manner, right? We have this picture in our head that was drilled into us from step 1 and step 2 board exams, whatever, of the typically presenting patients. But a patient doesn't read the textbook, as we say, and patients uniquely present in different ways. And that is an issue for clinicians to diagnose. This is where AI is actually better than a physician. They look at the whole picture. They look at tiny little details that we may not think are part of this disease cluster, but they are. And then they raise the flag of, hey, maybe you should consider testing this patient for porphyria. Even though this patient is male, is Hispanic, and is only presenting with back pain and chronic constipation and developmental delay, these people also have porphyria. They just present differently. It totally depends on the type of genotype they have and the overlying RNA. Things that we are now only discovering, small interfering RNA molecules, can also change the way that a disease presents phenotypically. So the EHR record is equally as important, I would say, as the genetic data that we have. And that's sort of where we could potentially counteract the VOS problem of, what are you going to do with a variant of uncertain significance? I don't know. It's a pathogen. This is a problem I encounter in clinic practice every day. I get a VOS back. How do I decide whether or not this is pathogenic or not if it's never been reported in literature, right? I need to do a lot of research in different databases to check, has this variant been listed anywhere as pathogenic, which is a lot of work and nobody has time for that. But if I did have time for that, and let's say there is nothing listed, then I have to decide as the physician, do I think that this is the cause for this patient's symptoms, right? And that's only possible to do by looking at what is the effect clinically on this patient. Does this patient actually suffer in a way that is in relation to what this gene does? And then I can classify this VUS as, yes, this is pathogenic.
And the algorithm isn't just looking at the types of blood test results or something like that, but you're looking at things like emergency room visits.
Yes, everything and everything. So tiny little things that you don't think have anything to do with each other. Constellations and clusters, things like how many times does this patient present to what type of physician? What do they keep saying? What do their lab values look like? And also what types of medications are they on? That can be an indication of what might possibly be lingering in the background that we don't know about.
So how did this lead to you founding zebraMD, and what is zebraMD seeking to do?
So after this project was concluded, I thought to myself, well, this is definitely super interesting. I could keep doing just predictive models for rare disease and do research in this, but it was frustrating to me as a physician to not be able to use this existing research and knowledge in clinical practice. So that's why I founded zebraMD, to kind of bridge the gap between what Melissa and Erik are doing and bring that into the clinical environment. I want to use this knowledge as a physician at the point of care, and zebraMD is supposed to do that with an app that lives inside the EHR, uses several different databases, such as Erik's and Melissa's, interfaces with the EHR, makes a decision based on all the information we have available, and tells the physician at the point of care, hey, this patient may have undiagnosed XYZ disease. Here's how you would test for them. Or if they're already diagnosed, it can give you management recommendations to more appropriately manage these rare disease patients, even out in the community, in primary care. You don't need to come to an academic hospital for that.
So if you are here in our last panel, and I'm not going to get this right, but Simon talked a lot about the need to standardize several other things like that. I think of your phenopackets. What are phenopackets, and how can that help with the diagnostic odyssey, particularly when applying AI?
Phenopackets is an idea that I had when, so fundamentally, for building informatics tools that might be deployed in the kinds of contexts that we just heard about, which, by the way, I just want to say, I've been talking about the general practice Zebra button for probably 15 years now, and you've actually done it. So thank you. Because it really is that bringing all the work that we do upstream, to that point of care, and making it available to general practitioners who don't need it all the time. They don't need that kind of messiness of trying to interpret a rare disease when they don't have any suspicion of one, but boy, when they have a suspicion of one. So that's a big part of it. But part of the problem, coming back to the phenopackets question, is, we really struggle with, when new rare diseases are identified all the time. Patients are diagnosed all the time, even though it often feels like it's not often enough. But that information sits in researchers and clinicians, laptops until a paper is written, and then we curate that literature, and that takes a long time. So this is another part of the slowness of how we decide, what constitutes the sort of textbook definitions of rare diseases. But the reality is that and this is maybe a little bit of a philosophy of mine, is that every person is an N of one rare, healthy, or diseased state, right? And the question is, what are the useful classifications that can help with clinical decision support? And because of that, when we write these papers in the literature, they're often, well, this many patients had this feature, or this many patients had this lab value, but not the exact features of each individual patient. And because of that, we don't actually know what that scatter, that spread of different features are. We see them absolutely in the electronic health record, but a lot of features that we need to understand about the patient are not captured in an electronic health record. To your point earlier about many aspects are not capturable in the electronic health record. And so we wanted a way to sort of capture that individual variability for EHR clinicians to send to clinical labs for their interpretation, for publishers to start publishing that information in the literature, so we could start to get a better handle on what actually does that scatter look like, so that because not everyone will fit in that textbook definition. And then finally, I think just how do we actually use that information to improve the overall diagnosis as its own AI question. So once we have that, we have the ability to combine genotype information and phenotype information to build better AI-based diagnostic tools. And one of the challenges that we've historically had in building those tools is that we have lots of genotype information, even though there are many variants of unknown significance in those databases, and they're very biased towards white Caucasians from Europe, and that's a different problem we could talk about separately, which is not going to be solved by AI. And then we have lots of phenotypic information in de-identified electronic health record systems and other contexts, but never shall the two marry, right? And so this is the problem. We can't associate those VUSs with the clinical outcomes because we don't have a de-identified way of sharing the tidbits of phenotypic information that could really help us. So there's a database of variants called Nomad that's used by lots of diagnostic tools, but it has no phenotype data, and it's never going to get any because there's not any way of sharing that. So the PhenoPacket was designed for a very lightweight, de-identified way to sort of express the characteristics of that individual patient in such a way that we can actually compute over both genotype and phenotype information on the individual level, and then taking all those PhenoPackets together as, for all patients to be able to understand that genotypic and phenotypic distribution across all rare diseases.
You're also applying AI to electronic health records.
Yes.
What is Alamaya Health, and what is the vision for that?
So Alamaya Health is a brand new B corporation that we started. It was co-founded by myself and several others, including Neil Burkle, who helped launch the undiagnosed disease program originally at the NIH. And the reason we started this company was because we really felt that patients that have access to expert diagnosticians like yourself are very fortunate, but the majority of the population worldwide does not have that. And we wanted to bring sequencing technologies and variant interpretation technologies to the point of care in rural and disadvantaged contexts, or contexts that simply don't have the expertise. So, to your point earlier that, there's lots of general practitioners out there that don't know what to do when they have a rare disease case. So really teaching these sort of community hospitals, and it's a global effort, so working with other nations that don't really have what we have here in the United States, to help them develop their own capacity to diagnose their own patients by putting cost-effective physical sequencing tools and the phenotyping and diagnostic software that sits on top of that, and then teaching them how to use it and teaching them how to overcome the policy and regulatory hurdles that they have in their country or in their state, to get them certified, like in the US as a CLIA certification. It's not the same in every country, but so that they can serve themselves. And so it's really dedicated towards making genomic medicine available for everyone.
So I had an AI executive recently remark to me that it's more about the data than the algorithm, which is a fancy way of saying garbage in, garbage out. but I'm curious what you see as the data challenge, particularly in training these AI models and what you have to do to validate them, particularly in rare disease where there may be limited data. All of you, please, jump in.
There are, I will separate the data question into three separate elements. One is data integrity. That means to get data that is fully diagnosed by from a reliable source that you know that what you're looking at is a source of truth. That's one challenge. The other challenge is how do you get the data diversified enough in terms of age, race, ethnicity, expression of disease, et cetera, because the way the diseases express themselves are obviously very, very individual. So you need to have a very, very diversified view of that. And in rare disease settings, it's obviously quite hard. And then the third challenge of the data is the challenge of regulatory and compliance. And I don't have another way of saying it, but it's just regulatory and compliance sometimes is committed to make sure that AI will never take off. It's like, you need to do all this, but you can't have any information. So go ahead and figure it out. The amount of limitations that are being put by the same people who try to push for this to do better is something that the world will need to kind of resolve. And I say the world because at the end of the day, everything begins and ends like with the patient, and it's a patient decision whether they want to contribute the data or not, and how they want to do it. It's their identity and it's their face. And we were dealing with biometric data from like 2 decades ago when we created a technology for detecting health biomarkers in the voice signal. And we were one of the very first to introduce this challenge to the European community to say, is a voice biomarker, even if de-identified, is it PHI or not? Is it protected health information or not? And this is most of the challenge actually today, if you ask me, is how to work in a productive way with the regulatory limitations in that process, because we were able to solve most of everything else. But and parents deserve their privacy. Patients deserve their privacy. And I think that today, though, between the GDPR and HIPAA, which are two very different approaches to health, two very schools of thought. One is giving the patient full control and the right to delete and withhold, and the other focuses on how to protect what you already have. I think between these two frameworks, this is where the magic is, or where the solution is. I'm sorry, but when you look at the business as a business around AI, I think there are more companies that claim to have AI than there are actually rare disease patients. But when you see them, you actually will discover that many of them have a really genius AI algorithms, like really great thinkers, great models. I have a lot of respect for what they did from a technology point of view, but they have zero data, or if not zero, then far from the critical mass that is needed to actually be very, very meaningful. And this is the challenge, and a lot of that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. So I do want to share, though, around the question of diversity. We found something very interesting. So we're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and just happens to be a state I know relatively well. And what's interesting about Georgia, about Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta is the hub for many health centers. Like you have everything from the CDC to, Emory and all the other big players. And in our direct-to-consumer app, our child development checker, we found something fascinating. Atlanta is about greater Atlanta. I want to say greater Atlanta, not just the city, but with the surrounding area, is probably 6 million residents, give or take. This is in a state with 11 million residents. So you're looking at a place that has about 50 to 60%, say 55% of the state's residents are in that space. But what we found that only hardly 10% of our cases come from the Atlanta area because they have access to all those medical centers. And we found that 80% of the cases come from people who are at least 2 hours away from the closest doctor. And if you look at the map, like it's amazing. You see those clusters. And we found that many of them are minorities. Many of them are, from an underprivileged social economic background, like people that do not even appear on the radar. They don't even make their way to an EHR in many ways. So they're just not there because the parents don't even have the pediatrician to start the conversation with, or don't have the knowledge how to start the conversation with the pediatrician from, in a way that will get them to the right place. And it really inspired us to go and invest in more in this because we realized that by empowering the parents, we actually solved a major diversity problem that many of the cases that are currently do not appear in the AI engines are there up for the taking, and parents are eager to share, eager to give, eager to be a part of the solution, but it didn't have how. And that increased the diversity and the diversification of our data tremendously. And thank God that here in the US, it's a lot easier than in other parts of the world, but it has been a tremendous accelerator of the AI capacity.
So we talked about the electronic health record, but this was essentially built to meet the need of payers. We're finding it's a very valuable tool for research. Is there any move to alter electronic health records to make them more useful? Go for it.
I spent a lot of my life working on this. There is. And, I think, well, so first I want to answer very briefly your question about garbage in, garbage out. So one of the things that we do worldwide, but especially here in the United States, is, we have federated systems for linking electronic health record data across systems. And it's, through Care Everywhere and, ONC protocols, it's possible to move data around for care, but it's really not been done before for research. And so as part of the All of Us research program, we've been working with ONC and that process of leveraging that network to actually be able to integrate electronic health records from different places. So that improves the quality, and more than the quality, it improves the comprehensiveness of an individual patient's medical history, as you all know, especially for rare disease patients that walk around with suitcases full of content only to have the same tests done over and over again, right? So I think that's part of it. But in lieu of that, we have these federated systems, and they, people assume that because it meets a certain common data model or a certain data standard, that it's consistent and comparable across healthcare systems. And we do these federated analytics, and we just presume that everything behind the firewall is A-OK. But when you actually integrate that data directly, centralize it, you realize that it's a mess, actually. Our electronic healthcare data is not the same. It's not comparable and consistent across individual sites. And we often don't know the history of the data that lives behind those firewalls. And so this is one of the biggest issues that I think we are really starting to overcome is, what are people doing to that data to make it comparable and consistent so that we know we can rely on it? And AI can help us do that as well as help us reveal when it hasn't been done. So we're actually using AI to help improve the quality of the data, but also help improve our processes to improve the quality of the data. And then finally, to answer your second question about how do we, make our electronic health record systems do more for us, so they're not really just designed for billing. So, working with, just as one example, working with the Intelligent Medical Objects company who delivers terminological content to electronic health records and other clinical systems, to start putting coding systems that aren't used for billing directly into the care system. So similar to what you're doing is just sort of really bring that content so it sits next to the billing systems so that we can start to make what is arguably the electronic disease encounter record into an electronic health portal. And the other thing that really needs to be done there is to also, and I just want to make this point because we've talked a lot about variants and genetic testing, is that there's a lot of rare diseases that are not genetic. And, it's Rocky Mountain spotted fever is rare. One of my very dear colleagues just got diagnosed with that. It was a very hard and long diagnosis. It's, and it's those patients tends to be fatal, right? So we have a lot of environmental factors that we are now as part of the All of Us research program, as well as part of the National Clinical Cohort Collaborative that I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, linking all of those environmental and social factors directly into the health record and finding ways to present those to clinicians so that they can take those factors into account as well. So it's not only, the patient's reports and the clinical labs, but also the context in which those patients are presenting also matters. Do they live near, a nuclear power plant? Do they, what's their sort of environmental and social history, and taking those kinds of things into account. And that's in fact how my colleague got diagnosed with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, was the environmental piece, not based purely on the symptoms.
We're going to questions in one moment, but I just want to ask, payers or culture, which do you see as a bigger barrier to clinical adoption? Are doctors ready to embrace this, or are payers ready to embrace this?
I think as long as we can make an argument of how we can save the payers money, they like to see and hear that. That is something that we are doing with our app too. We're doing a before and after evaluation of the EHR and the health utilization to show them, hey, now that you're appropriately diagnosing and managing these people, they don't come to the emergency room that often, they don't have all these bills anymore. And so now it becomes a benefit for the health system. So they're easily convinced if you can show them the money, right? The culture side of things, physicians are willing to try it if it is right the first time. I think that is a potential problem in terms of you need to prospectively test these models in a research environment before you put them out in clinical practice. Because once the AI disappoints you with a clinical suggestion that's definitely very wrong, you will never trust it again. So in order to prospectively test it, you need to have an IRB in place. There's some red tape. It takes some time. It's not impossible, but it is a deterrent for fast, easy QI research. So the IRBs, I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's a process of, at a health institution, you have to apply for an institutional review board telling them, hey, I want to test this in our clinical practice. Here are the potential risks and benefits. Here is how I'm going to inform the patients and the providers. And then a board committee overlooks my project and says yes or no, or we need more information. And that process can take 9 months approximately. After 9 months, then I'm allowed to actually start it. So now I need to build that into the EHR. That takes another year or so. And then I'm going to test it, which is another year. So there's a very long process that can definitely be shortened. In some institutions, there's now a fast review. At UCLA, it took us roughly 2 weeks to do it. At Dartmouth, it takes us 9 months, So different institutions, but we're getting there over time.
That seemed like a fairly idealized view of payers. And I'm curious.
Actually, I'm agreeing with that. I think it's I think if you understand the role of the payers are not the enemy. Payers have one job. If you understand their business, it's very simple. They're in the business of risk management, in the business of financial risk management. All they need to see is that the financial data aligns and they can manage their financial risk. They're good and they will play ball. I think on what you just recapped, I think it's a great summary. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, we've got some questions from the audience here and online. I'll do one if others want to raise their hand. When FDNA performs sponsored genetic testing, what types of tests are done? Are they whole genome, whole exome, or targeted testing on the top candidate genes faced gene identifies?
Okay, so yeah, this is where my limited clinical knowledge may be exposed in public. The short summary is this: we have started with lysosomal disorders, so we This is the first family of conditions we focus on. We perform an exome test on an NGS backbone. So we would sequence all, but we would interpret only a limited set. And then we will be expanding that set. We use a swap kit that we send to the parents send it back, and then we would go through the test and do the reading on this limited set that currently includes about 60 genes that we focus on. We'll be expanding it to 100, then to 500, and so on until we'll cover all. But in the first phase is around these conditions that present themselves in a relatively high prevalence.
Great, thank you. Got one over here.
Thank you. A really terrific panel discussion. Paul Howard, Amicus Therapeutics. I'm curious if you think, and it's a leading question because I think this is true, is that the equity question and the ability to develop therapeutics go hand in hand, because a real challenge, as you know well, in the rare disease biotech space is just finding patients. It's just an incredible challenge. And if we can scale up systems, especially to people who, as you said, don't live near a center of excellence or are facing a physician who has cognitive overload because of the other needs that they're dealing with in their communities, we can help identify those patients, get them to a faster diagnosis. But that can also help us make the case that, you know, there is a successful financial risk reward here that can drive a product forward to approval. We need lots of different financial models, especially for ultra rare diseases. But I think this equity case and the AI patient finding case really seem to play well in terms of expanding equity and access at the same time. I was wondering if you agree.
Yeah, so maybe to that point, I would say that from our perspective, we divide the equity challenge into two separate buckets that have some overlap. One is lack of education and lack of financial means. These are not the same. For the most part, we found that it's the lack of knowledge and education that is the bigger barrier than the lack of means. So many parents just don't even know how to engage in the conversation. Like, you can have all the money in the world and that will maybe give you access to more. But the moment parents have become empowered, we see them as engaged, empowered from a place of knowledge. They become as engaged as parents with a different financial background. So that's one statement that I wanted to make. I'm very passionate about making parents better advocates for their child's health as a driver toward equity, giving parents the knowledge and the means and the language and the terminology and the confidence to engage in the conversation as stakeholders of significant weight. But on the first comment that I made, it's something that I find hugely important too, is the role of AI overall is not just in the diagnostic process per se, because if you really think about that, it creates financial viability for pharma companies to invest and sponsor and do more and make things accessible. It makes payers be more open to the process. And this is where the money is in healthcare. In healthcare, we either save money for the payers or make money for pharma, right? In healthcare, like, these are your two things. Right. So if you can take those two very significant powerhouses of funding, participate in the process by leveraging the technology to solve for their financial need, they will allocate a lot of resources to make, the or the vision of equity come true. So you will see pharma funding tests. You will see pharma funding clinical trials. You will see payers being more open to paying for a test where they know that the test will yield a meaningful result, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where the equity challenge is in many ways, is somebody needs to pay for it, right? And as long as we align financial incentives, you have the way of making those participants solve for this with us, and not work against us.
So just to kind of add on to that, I think, one of the things that we lack in this country is national electronic health record infrastructure. And as part of the pandemic, because we don't have nationalized healthcare, we also don't have national healthcare data. And there are pockets where there are larger, organizations that do have access to that. But fundamentally, when you're working in your own institution, we don't have enough rare disease patients to find the rare disease patients that, to your point, that we might need. But because of the pandemic, we were actually able to create public health infrastructure that harmonized electronic health record data from across the country. And so now we can start to build computable phenotypes for many rare diseases to sort of partner with pharma to say, yes, there is a large enough population. And if we do that in a way that, is unbiased in terms of that data collection, by working with safety net hospitals and other organizations that are not just the fancy pants academic medical centers, then we can actually, start to tackle that. And it's really an exciting time to be able to do that. And so, call your congressman and tell them that we need this national health infrastructure to exist beyond the purposes of COVID, and to really stop with the sort of bucket brigade of the way we report diseases in this country, where we say, oh, we have this many patients that had this condition, and we report that up to the ONC. That's not how you do public health surveillance for anything, really. It's just sort of very high level, and there's lots of mapping steps along the way that make it really challenging to know what's happening. But rather from a bottom-up perspective, how do we do screening of all populations for, your story is a wonderful one, but how can we apply those kinds of techniques at scale across the whole nation? We can do it. We have the technology. The problem is policy, not technology. And AI will help us do that, since it's an AI session, but it's the policy problems that are going to stop us from leveraging that AI.
So I know we're out of time. If you have a question you didn't get asked, please corral our speakers as they try to get out of here. But let me ask you as a parting shot, I'm sure everyone in this audience has at some point used Google or WebMD to diagnose themselves. As we get better AI tools, do you think patients are going to be enable themselves to be better advocates for testing as these tools become publicly available?
I have the mic, so I'll start and I'll pass it down I'll do it real fast. So for our tools, we have made them LLM enabled, so you can actually chat with our entire knowledge base. So a patient can do it, a clinician can do it, and you can start to say, ask our knowledge graph that has all the disease gene relationships in them about your own symptoms. It's all translated into layperson, and then you could take that to your clinician. So absolutely, the answer is yes.
And yes, so we are also having a patient-facing side of our Zebra button that we are going to utilize with their EHR data married with existing databases and existing research to give them the tools to go to see a physician and say, hey, this app says that I have a likelihood of this. Maybe I should get tested for this, and here's how I need to get tested. Therefore, they do a little bit of legwork for us, which is great. So no objections from my perspective.
I would say that diagnosis and healthcare in general is a human-centric process. So, and parents need empathy as much as they need data. So I believe that AI will provide the data and the confidence component, but on its own, I think it's essential but insufficient. And there has to be a human involved in the flow. So yes, it would empower. Yes, it would enable that expert and that physician to help 100 families instead of 5, and it would enable those who don't have access right now to have access. But I think for the next 100 years, if I may be so bold as to make a prediction about something so far out of sight, I think that the human aspect of the healthcare process is not going away anywhere, and AI is a great source of knowledge and data. But empathy is, I think, not in the development phases as far as I know.
Well, please join me in thanking this wonderful group of panelists.